Welcome to the Midnight Report. We're going to be continuing on as we look at some of the theories about who actually killed JonBenet Ramsey. And so we talked about the intruder theory in the last episode. We went through it, why it possibly could have happened, why it might have not happened. And we're going to do the exact same thing this week, looking at the John Ramsey theory. And right away, I want to say this is a theory. This is not something that is factual. This is built on other people's thoughts on it. It's not even my own opinions onto what actually I think happened in this case, but I do want to look at it and point to some of the interesting points of this case that maybe warrant looking at further, or even some of the things that I didn't get to fully expand upon when I talked about this in my documentary, and even gathering more information upon researching for further videos, and also looking at some of your guys' own thoughts in the comments about what you guys think possibly happened. So let's get into it, and I want to start with a little bit of some background information. So like I do in every one of these videos, I kind of want to state the obvious. In terms of likelihoods, and when we look at the case and JonBenet being found murdered in her own home, like I've always said, the overwhelming percentage of cases would indicate that it was a family member or a parent. And even if you look at the last video I did with the intruder, or somebody that knew the family. Now, it's a bit different because of who JonBenet was. She was somebody that was competing in child beauty pageants, so she was exposed to a lot more than the average child in terms of possible child predators and things like that. But this video is not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on why people believe that maybe John Ramsey did it. And so when you point to this statistic about it likely being a family member, the FBI even supported this, saying that this is who the Boulder police should have looked at that very day. Now, we know that the Boulder police did not instantly do this. They were evaluating all the different leads that they had, but they did eventually look at the parents. Now, looking past the obvious statistic that indicates a family member, let's look at JonBenet herself and kind of the lead up to the night that she died. So looking at JonBenet, she was a 6-year-old girl and was known to be having bedwetting issues. Now, having bedwetting at, age 6, especially regularly, is not common. It's not something that necessarily should be happening. It is something that could be happening, but I want to point this out. It's said that JonBenet actually did get better, but then in the month of December, she started having more bedwetting issues. They started to spring up again. We know even from Patsy that she had like a frustration of cleaning up this. And of course, what parent wouldn't have frustrations when their child is bedwetting all of the time? And it's a lot to deal with. And especially when you add on to that as well, when you have the housekeeper, who is where we get a lot of this kind of information from about what some of the child behavior was and some of the issues. We also, it seems that Burke also was having some issues in terms of he was spreading feces in JonBenet's own bed. So there was a lot of things that were just weird going on. But a lot of people have latched onto the bedwetting idea because it is uncommon. It is quite rare at her age. And so let's maybe take a look at that and why that could apply to especially this theory. Because the bedwetting issue, and so the bedwetting issues exclusively are talked about in the John and Patsy theories. Both theories seem to indicate in one way or another that the bedwetting was a cause of her death. But let's look at it just from an analytical point of view, and even looking at the medical report and the bedwetting. So from my own research and looking at what medical experts and professionals have said on this issue of bedwetting, especially at older ages in relation to sexual abuse, this is what popped up. When the child previously had no bedwetting issues, or it suddenly returns or escalates, it usually seems to occur after a triggering event, and especially if it happens in a child older than the typical potty regression age. JonBenet was 6 years old, well beyond the normal development regression window. So what is this saying right away? It's just saying the idea that when a child doesn't have any bedwetting issues and then has them, that's a major red flag. Now, that's not the case with this case because we know that JonBenet did have bedwetting issues before this point. But the second part of that is the more important part. It suddenly returns or escalates. That's exactly what happened in this case. JonBenet seemed like her bedwetting issues were solved, but then the beginning of December, the bedwetting issues started again. And so based upon development regression windows about a child then regressing back to having bedwetting issues, JonBenet was well past the normal window, so either JonBenet was a very special and rare case, which is very possible. The more likely outcome is that a triggering event happened. Something happened that made JonBenet regress. That is where we start to look at the possibility of sexual abuse, because sexual abuse would be that triggering event. It would be that thing, and that is scientifically proven that yes, that could be an indicator. And so does that indicate that, oh yeah, she was being sexually abused? No. But given everything we're going to talk about, especially with the autopsy report, it does appear that it could be the case. It does appear more likely than not likely in a lot of ways. So let's then turn to the autopsy report. This is what the general findings were about the sexual assault and or JonBenet's genital region and what was found. So there seemed to be a pattern of prior repeated genital irritation / assault. And so this would indicate this wasn't something that just popped up that night that some sexual predator assaulted her and that was just the end of it. This would seem to indicate that there was something that was going on over a certain amount of time. And this is interesting, especially given the fact that even if it's not related to this case, there was something else going on. So whether JonBenet was being sexually abused by, I don't know, a doctor or somebody that she was around, or if you do believe it was, the parents, it seems something darker was going on in this case that kind of gets blown over a little bit. Something that I myself in my documentary wasn't really sure what to do with in terms of the sexual abuse, and with this theory and the research for it, it's quite an interesting argument. But that isn't to say that during that night nothing happened to JonBenet sexually, because there does seem to be an acute injury. And that doesn't mean that JonBenet was violently sexually assaulted. I'm avoiding saying the word that starts with an R because then YouTube will not like this video, not send it out to you guys much at all. But just know that there was, it seems like, at least an attempted sexual assault maybe on JonBenet, but it didn't really get that far. Or maybe it was set up. One of those two ideas. Now, that is really important because this is in a lot of ways the entire foundation for the John Ramsey theory. And for me myself, if you guys have watched my previous videos, you know this isn't the theory I believe, but it's a compelling start to a theory. Now, I think this is horrifying for JonBenet if this is something that was happening to her, but let's continue on. So what do I think truly happened that night if John Ramsey was the person who killed and staged everything? Not like when I talk with, say, the Burke theory. I think the Burke theory, which, again, all alleged, it's a theory, it's my opinion. I think that, yes, John was the person that ended up killing her with the garrote. I think that it was actually Burke that was the person that, made her brain dead. This is not that. This is that John Ramsey was the person that caused there to be some sort of damage to her head and then also killing her with the garrote. So let's go through that night and give, I think for me, the most plausible way I could see this ending up going. So upon returning to the home from the Christmas party the night that JonBenet died, JonBenet was put to bed. Now this does not mean that she went to bed and that she was asleep, as we've been told a lot of contradictory evidence to say that, at least for the moment, Burke, who is said to have been put asleep at this point as well, it seems like he got up. He seemed to admit this on the Dr. Phil interview. And there's going to be some interesting information that's going to play into maybe how I think this could have gone down. So the issue then is, at this point, you have John and Patsy then, who they're doing their normal routine, getting prepared to leave the next day, and Patsy and John go to sleep. Or at least John would maybe pretend to go to sleep until Patsy is fully asleep. John then gets up, and at this point we have to connect a lot of dots. There's not a lot of evidence to indicate any of this stuff. This is all theory-based, so I want to really point that out here. But at this point, we have to figure out, how does the Burke stuff and the pineapple that was in JonBenet play into this theory? How do we explain that in a way that could make any sense? So the only way I can really see this going down is that after Burke was put down to go to sleep, he then ended up getting up, going for a late night snack, maybe getting some pineapple, and at this, JonBenet follows him down maybe, or is awoken by Burke getting up, and so she follows him down to also get a snack. Again, you see the kind of the same story of what I proposed with the Burke theory, because I just think there's a lot of evidence there that you have to account for if you're going to make a theory where the Ramseys were involved in any way. And so Burke going down getting a snack and also John Bonet following would at least fulfill some of the circumstantial evidence. We know the idea that Burke tells Dr. Phil he went downstairs. It would also indicate why there was pineapple in her digestive system in terms of John Bonet, because she didn't have any at the party, and even if she did, it might have already digested by the time her autopsy happens and all that. And so at this point, we turn back to John Ramsey, and John Ramsey going down the stairs would catch them both out of bed. And at this point, he would do kind of your normal parent thing. He would, send them to bed, all that kind of stuff. But this is where the story takes a dark turn. And once again, I really want to emphasize there's not a lot of circumstantial evidence to point to this being the fact of any of this happening. But if you want to go down this theory, and what I've seen most people explore is the idea that now that John Bonet was alone, Patsy was fast asleep, Burke was sent to his room, at this point, John might have began to try and sexually assault his daughter, given the fact that we'd had maybe some evidence that there was sexual abuse that was ongoing. And at some point, maybe something went wrong and John Bonet hit her head on something really hard, and that caused her to more or less go brain dead. And so at this point, for John, you have the issue of, okay, if you're caught doing this, or if somebody figures out what you just did, you're going to prison for the rest of your life. So you can't go to a hospital. Even if you knew she was still alive, you're not going to go to a hospital with this. You're not going to just say, oh, she had a bump. Because there is going to be that acute injury, to her vaginal area. They'll find out that there was ongoing sexual abuse there, possibly. So I don't see a situation in which, if this did happen, if John, in the middle of sexually assaulting her, it got too rough or something. This is just horrible to talk about. And then John Bonet hit her head, and that caused everything to spiral out of control. So then John Ramsey starts trying to figure out, how can I stage everything? How can I get away with it, more or less? And so at that point, he starts fashioning the garrote, ends up, fully killing her at this point. And this is where we kind of have some issues with this theory, because I think there's only two ways you can go from here. Either one, you have Patsy is involved. And I will talk about this in the negatives of this theory, but let's just say that John tells Patsy what happened and has Patsy write the note, and so that would make sense as to why she couldn't be cleared, that the handwriting analysis couldn't be confirmed it was Patsy's, but couldn't be denied it was hers either. There were similarities there, and so he has Patsy do that, and then John goes about maybe arranging her body, all that kind of stuff. And that is the idea of John and Patsy did this together. I don't like that theory at all. I don't like the idea that John and Patsy did this together, because why would Patsy, if John basically just killed their daughter and was sexually abusing her, go along with this? Maybe it's the idea that just Patsy didn't want to lose John. Maybe she was just head over heels so much for John that she wasn't willing to go against him, or she was maybe afraid to. There's a lot of issues with it. We'll talk about it later on, but let's then focus back to if it was just John himself. So John at this point crafts the ransom note, and maybe because he was disguising his handwriting, he subconsciously made it somewhat similar to Patsy's. Again, there's no matchings for John writing the note. He was completely cleared of writing the note. So either, if this is the case that he, one, was able to disguise his handwriting perfectly, or two, is that Patsy wrote it. So either way, the ransom note in this scenario would be used as a red herring. It would be used in a lot of ways to point the police away from the parents. It would be so that it could buy maybe John some time to kind of figure out what he's going to do. And so I think the ransom note, it's also clear right away that if we're going to go down this theory, the idea for John is, okay, it says don't call the police, don't call anybody. It could be used for just buying John some time. And also, you think about the wording. John talks about the wording a lot. He wasn't sure if they were going to get the call that next morning or the day after, given the wording, even though it seems very clearly that you would be thinking it would be that morning that John Bonet Ramsey is found dead. But if he was maybe, he's writing it at night, maybe he thought, maybe it's not that morning, the next day, that could buy him more time. And so the idea would be that in a perfect scenario for John Ramsey in this theory, the idea would be, okay, Patsy finds the note that morning. Patsy doesn't call the police, comes to John, tells him everything that happened. So then John could then say to Patsy, okay, take Burke, get out of the house, and I'll deal with this, and all that kind of stuff. And then at that point, John could dispose of his daughter's body and kind of get the crime scene ready for when the police come. That would be the overall idea I think that people have posed with the ransom note and John in this theory. So that could make sense for a lot of reasons. The problem just comes with, okay, the handwriting for the ransom note doesn't match John's at all. He's not a match for it whatsoever. So would he have been able to do that? Also, why, if you're John Ramsey, if the point of it was to just not call the police, all that kind of stuff, for Patsy to find, why write it a 2.5-page note? And maybe that could just be he's not experienced in writing a ransom note or whatever. Again, there's some holes here, but let's just say it gets to the morning, Patsy calls the police. This instantly is a huge problem for John in this theory, because the idea would then become you have a body in your basement. Now, there's another part of this that I didn't really talk about, but the idea is if you're trying to hide it from Patsy and Burke, you put it in a place they wouldn't go to, like this very hidden basement room that she's eventually found in. It would not be in a place that Burke and, Patsy would really stumble upon. And this would also explain maybe the suitcase that was down there. If John, his initial plan would be put his daughter in the suitcase and then, get her out of there. I don't know if I buy that, but that's just overall what I've seen people talk about. Again, going back to it, Patsy calls the police, calls people over. It's not going the way that John necessarily thought, if you believe it's just John who is involved in the theory. And this is where it gets even more contradictory, is if you believe John and Patsy were involved in this together with this theory, it doesn't make sense for Patsy to call the police here. You would assume you would want to buy yourself more time, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe it was the idea that John then that night had just kind of always planned on calling the police in the morning, having the body be arranged, all that kind of stuff. And so it really does just come down to, do you think Patsy was involved in the cover-up? And that's the other part of it. So as we then get to that morning, and maybe if John was working alone in this, at this point, when he goes missing, there's a point of time during that morning where he is not accounted for by the Boulder police, and he just goes missing. Now, John kind of defends this, but let's just say in this hypothetical, he then, realizing he can't get the body out, then prepared her body to be found, and all of that. John then, as time is going on, he's getting more and more anxious because nobody's finding the body. As soon as he gets an excuse to go search or anything like that, he goes down, finds her body, contaminates the scene, especially given the one he would have been the one that killed her. He then contaminates it even more. And then at this point, you just follow the same pattern. The thing with these theories is that they all kind of play out the same after everything's happened, just in terms of, okay, the Ramseys' actions afterwards are quite suspicious. The way they hold themselves, quite suspicious. The circumstantial evidence against them, all that kind of stuff. It just kind of gets into repetition throughout all of these. The Ramseys, regardless of you think whatever they did, they didn't hold themselves that well. They didn't defend themselves very well at all. So that kind of gets me to where I want to take a step back now. Let's take a step back and look at my actual thoughts, because my actual thoughts for this case, I disagree almost completely with the John Ramsey theory that he either did it alone or did it with Patsy. I just don't believe it at all. Because in my opinion, there is enough to suggest that there was some sort of sexual issues going on with JonBenet, but there's not nearly enough evidence to say that this was the father or the mother or whoever. This could have easily have been a doctor, or this easily could have been somebody she knew from wherever in some of these pageants, and maybe horrible things were done to her. There's just not enough evidence to directly implicate that any of the Ramseys were sexually abusing her. There's just not any evidence to indicate that, outside of the idea that, yes, it seems JonBenet could have been sexually abused. We just don't know by who. And so that part of it already, the foundation of this theory, has cracks in it quite a lot. Other things that I really dislike in this theory, I just don't see a scenario in which if John Ramsey had been both sexually abusing and then killed his own daughter, that Patsy would just back him. I just don't see how that would happen. I think Patsy would turn on him at some point. I think at some point she would have exposed him. And so if it was that John Ramsey did it himself, I just find it hard to believe that at no point Patsy would ever question, that night. I also want to add to this the idea of like, okay, well, why didn't Burke ever say anything? It's because John, kept him quiet, made sure to tell him, don't say anything, any of that stuff. But again, it's just, there's too much here that it's like, okay, Burke has to not say anything about his father coming down and putting him back to bed after having this pineapple, and the suspiciousness of that wouldn't be all that suspicious for Burke, right? Because all Burke did was he went down to go have pineapple and then he got put to bed again. There was no need for that secrecy there, right? And so with this theory, it just, I can see the idea of how John Bonet gets killed in it, but I can't see the idea of like how this cover up goes almost completely perfect. They're not caught, like John's not caught specifically. Things don't make sense with the ransom note in terms of the handwriting, unless Patsy was involved, in my opinion. And even if Patsy's involved, it doesn't make sense, like of what I've just told you. I just don't think Patsy would have just stayed blindly loyal to John after the things that were done. And the other part of this is like, okay, if you're John and you're making this ransom note to try and buy time and get Patsy and Burke out of the house, all you had to really do was say, your daughter has been kidnapped. Do not call the police or else she dies. We will contact you at this point. That's all you had to say. You don't have to do 2.5 pages of a ransom note. And yes, that might help to redirect the police once they eventually get involved. But in terms of your big overarching plan to dispose the body, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so even though I do believe, like my opinion, again, it's my opinion. It's not fact. It's not any of this. I do think the Ramseys were involved with the death of their daughter. But I don't think it's by this way. Like this way, to me, there's too many like things that just don't fit. The puzzle pieces don't all fit that well. And so for me, like when I look at the theories, I think this is the most unlikely. We're going to talk about the Patsy theory in the next video, and I think it's much more likely than the John theory, even though I don't think it's the main theory either that I believe. I think, like, for instance, even the intruder theory is much more likely than the John theory, because the John theory just kind of goes with the idea that either he was able to get away with this all by himself while 2 other members of his family are still, were still living at the time and didn't rat on him or any of that stuff, and he just gets away with it. So I think the conclusion of this video is, I think the sexual abuse stuff that I pointed to at the very beginning of the video is the most important of this video, because it indicates information that could play into this overarching narrative of trying to find exactly what happened that night. But this theory that I brought up is almost completely theory. It almost has nothing to truly back it. It's a lot of, okay, let's try to fit it into this narrative. And one thing I've really found from researching the Madeleine McCann case, looking at how other YouTubers have covered it, looking at how other people have even talked about the case, whether it's just through a book or whatever, is so many people get distracted into, okay, I don't like this person, and there is some evidence to it, and so I'm only going to look at the evidence for that theory. The John Ramsey theory fits that to a T, in my opinion, is that from everything I've seen, it is a confirmation bias theory. It's a, okay, I already believe that this theory is the case, and I'm not willing to look at other information. So that is the video. I don't see a lot of people that generally believe this theory. I think most people, if they believe the Ramseys did it, it was either through Burke or Patsy. But I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts. If you have more that I didn't cover in this video that you think is relevant to it, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Just please try to keep it respectful, especially with each other, especially with me. And I want to really hammer this in here. This is my opinion. There's no need to bash each other just based upon what we believe happened in this case. And you might have a strong opinion that the Ramseys did absolutely nothing wrong here. There's nothing to say that they did. But if that is your opinion, please in the comments be respectful to me and others. So yeah, you can state your opinion, tell why you think so, and that's all fine and dandy. But thank you guys all for watching. I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.